right, let's testify, man. Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord, but you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. Tell the word of the hope I have found. You, Lord. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, do you believe it? Has He done it for anyone else? I said, has He done it for anyone else? Cause the God that I serve, He's always at work. Has He done it for anyone else? So come on and testify of the power of God. Come on and tell the world of the hope we have found. For our body was broken, our hearts were made whole, and that's too good to keep to yourself. Come on and testify of the power of God. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify your voice. This is my. So I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify. Come on, take it up. Jesus, my champion, the victor of grace, the only one worthy of all of my praise. Yeah. So come on and testify. Oh, somebody lift Him high. Come on, testify the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. Oh, for my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Sing that. Oh, my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, let's do that right now, Murfreesboro.
And good morning, everybody. Or afternoon, depending on where you're at. I'm sorry I am late. It's just been a week. But I do want to start out with something that came up last week. There were a couple of atheists that joined us who I'd never talked to before, at least to the best of my knowledge I haven't. And they had some interesting questions and some interesting challenges. And so, first and foremost, if they happen to see this, I want to say thank you for joining And for the most part, I mean, there were several atheists that actually joined last week. Two in particular, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. Glitched out bad. Glitchy there too. Well, let me take a look here. And oh wow, that's weird. Yeah, I see that. I wonder what's causing that. Huh. Okay, so yeah, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. You will see a few moments of I don't know if I try to play the song again, if that'll work, but I'll try playing the song again while I reboot the computer and see if that helps. If hopefully you could understand that. So I will be back as soon as possible. Although Bradley says it's all better now. Let me see. Well, yeah, now it seems like it's all right. All right, guys, let me know if it glitches out again, and if it does, if it glitches out again, then I'll try rebooting. Otherwise, we'll leave it for now because it's better to not reboot in the middle of a live stream if we can avoid it. All right, so make sure I don't know how much of what I said before was understandable. So let me go back to it. Last week, if you weren't here, it was a very, very spirited conversation. A few atheists that to the best of my knowledge, I'd never spoken to before, showed up, and two of them in particular had some really intelligent challenges, whereas the other was basically just your typical troll. But to the two that were genuinely trying to make arguments and challenging, I thank you. If you see this, I truly, truly appreciate genuine people trying to make genuine arguments, even if it's something I wholeheartedly disagree with. I welcome the challenge. One in particular came up a couple of times was something called the Hartle Hawking or Hawking Hartle proposition as to the beginning of the universe. And I didn't comment heavily on it because while I had heard of the Hartle Hawking proposal and I had read on it in the past, it had been a very long time since. I mean, because the Hartle Hawking proposal is nothing new. It dates back to 1983, and but it's been a long time since I've read up on it that I would consider myself fluent enough on it to actually speak on it. And while I did not go into detail, I just didn't have time to do like a detailed study of it this week, I did do a quick refresher to kind of remind myself of what it's all about. And it does, okay, so it's an interesting idea, but it's also, I think, a fundamentally flawed one. And it's got a similar flaw that other theories that have come out in recent days, recent meaning the last 50 years or so, because they tend to follow this pattern. And that is, if you cannot solve certain mathematical equations, cheat. At the core of the Hawking-Hurdle proposition, and the I don't like to put it that way, but it's true. It's kind of like when we talked about the concept of infinity. If somebody argues for anything that requires an infinite number of anything, it's a logically absurd argument because infinity itself is a logically absurd concept. Infinity is simply a placeholder for things that we have not worked out the math for. Anytime something in physics, for example, it's a problem with relativity when we talk about gravity, because one thing about relativity is it predicts the idea of singularities. That is, at points in space time where if gravity becomes heavy enough that it eventually folds into an infinitely dense and infinitely small space. That is logically absurd. There's no such thing as infinitely dense or infinitely small. And so that it's a nonsensical point, but it's because the mathematics of even Einstein were not sufficient to resolve what happens ultimately as matter collapses upon itself and folds space time to the ultimate extent. And we don't really know what that ultimate extent is. How far can space time be stretched? It's kind of like when we talk about things like the Planck length, or Planck, if you prefer, because is there a absolute smallest of small, right? And the opposite would also be an interesting question. Is there a largest of large? Because you cannot simply subdivide ad infinitum. There's not an infinite number of cuts that can be made. Now, some of those boundaries are very easily defined. So, for example, if you have water and you have a glass of water, you pour out half, now you get half, then you pour out half of that, you have half of that. And you can continue to do this, but eventually you get to the point where you have two water molecules and you move one water molecule out. Now you have a single water molecule. You cannot divide water any further than that and still call it water. Now, you can make divisions beyond that because, of course, water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. So you can separate a water molecule into two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. And so then you could take and so if you ditch the oxygen, now you have two hydrogen atoms. You can remove one hydrogen atom, you still have another hydrogen atom. But now you've reduced that as far as hydrogen can be reduced and still call it hydrogen. But it's made up of smaller components as well: protons, neutrons, electrons, right? And so you can break it into those. And those at can at least in certain circumstances can be divided into what we call quarks, right? And but then the question is, well, is that as small as it gets? Is there because the problem with a quark is that quarks have extraordinarily short half-lives. So if you have a quark, it's only going to exist for the briefest amount of time before it basically converts to energy. At which point, so as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this because I do not know that much about particle physics because quite frankly, I'm not that interested in particle physics. Although funny enough, driving Uber yesterday, I had a lovely lady, a physicist born in India but was currently a professor in South Africa, who was here in the United States visiting family for the holidays. And the nice thing is, I picked up this physicist and her son from the airport, and we had a rather long drive. It was like an hour and a half long drive to get to where she was going. And so, I picked her brain the whole time. But yeah, she teaches chemistry and particle physics. And no, Laura, she was not hot. She was in her 60s. But she was a very, very nice lady. But really, really enjoyed that. But when we talk about these particle physics, there's only so far we found that you can go. And quarks, so far as I understand, seems to be the limit. But one of the problems is you can't sustain a quark for any period of time in order to try to break it into something smaller. So who knows if there's some kind of sub quark or whatever. And that's when you get into things like the string hypothesis. I know people like to call it string theory, but it's not a theory scientifically unless it's been rigorously tested. And as of yet, there's no way to test string theory. So I hesitate to recognize it as a theory. But anyway, but the idea of the string hypothesis is to try and figure out the fundamental particle of all that is. And is that the quark? Is it, or is it something else? Is it? And the string would be what obviously string hypothesis suggests. So, what does this all have to do with the Hartle-Hawking proposal? Well, the Hartle-Hawking proposal is something that Hawking has done in other works of his. Uh, and as much as I have respect for Hawking, there comes a point where in the quest to eliminate the need for God, we simply replace God with mathematics. And when I say that, I mean that we will use mathematics that has no correlation to the real world, but try to say that proves a theory because mathematically it's sound, even though it wouldn't be sound in the real world. And the Hawking-Hartle proposal is such a theorem. And the idea here is the fundamental problem is that it uses a concept that Hawking was very big on in his day, which is imaginary time. And imaginary time uses a system called imaginary numbers. And for those of you that don't know, the imaginary numbers are signified by the letter I in algebraic terms. And I is the square root of -1. Now, most people, if you understand, a square root is basically a number that multiplied by itself equals whatever what you're going for. So if you're looking for the square root of 4, that it would be 2 because 2 times itself 2 equals 4. And so like the square root of 1 is 1 because obviously 1 times 1 equals 1. So I is the square root of -1 because that is in and of itself a logically absurd concept. There is no such thing as the square root of -1 because the problem is that like 1 times 1 equals 1. -1 times -1 also equals 1, not -1. The only way to get -1 is 1 times -1. And so, but that's not a square root because 1 and -1 are two different numbers. If you look at a number line, they're actually 2 digits apart from each other because there's 1, then 0, then -1. So 1 and -1 are just have as much in common as the number 1 and 3. They are that far apart from each other. So there really is, you cannot have a square root of a negative number. It's simply not possible mathematically. And so instead, we've come up with a system called imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers are the hypothetical square root of -1. What is that number? Well, it doesn't really exist, so we just call it I because it's imaginary. So, what does this have to do with Hawking-Hartle? Well, the way that they get around certain problems when dealing with time is they use imaginary numbers applied to time and they come up with imaginary time, and that resolves certain problems with the origin of the universe. But if you're using imaginary numbers to fix your equations, that's a conceit that your equation doesn't make sense. It is not, in fact, the it's not logically consistent. And so you might as well just be saying, magical fairies did it, because there's no logical explanation for it. So, in fact, if you are to suggest that something like imaginary time or using imaginary numbers to try and explain the quantum fluctuations of the early universe, which is what Hawking Hartle does, and that's Krauss does that as well. It's a common theme in this kind of stuff. Then that is, in fact, I think, less sound of an opinion as try and suggest that some, you know, supernatural deity did it, because at least a supernatural deity is an explanation that is logically consistent. But to suggest that something is, something that we know for a fact is an absurdity, is the solution to the problem, well, you get the idea. And Thomas says that Matthew left me a message on Twitter, but didn't know. No, I did not see. I'm so rarely on Twitter these days. I will go there and check it out, because I have not talked to Matthew in forever. Miss the guy. Matthew and I used to do, for those of you that weren't around back then, a show called Mystery Movie Nights with Matthew. It was so much fun, where we would watch really, really bad movies, and yeah, it was just a good time. But but then Matthew took on a pastoral position that basically made it so that he was no longer able to do that series with me. And I haven't really talked to him a lot since then. And yeah, he's a great guy. So let me see if I can find. Where is. Let's see. Phone. Yeah, I don't care about that. Um, Notification. Let's see. All right, here we go. Let's see. Welcome to the new X chat. Oh boy, they changed it. All right, okay, great. So I got to set a passcode for my X chat. All right, confirm passcode. And all right. And let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so let me see what he said. Oh, okay. Um, all right, so there, I responded to the message. Thank you, Thomas, for telling me. All right, so for those of you that may be big fans of the Hawking Hurdle proposal, again, I think that any solution that requires that you use logically absurd concepts like imaginary numbers, how is that any better than just saying God did it? Serious question. I understand that you think, so, and that's not, when I look at like the origin of the universe, I don't just sit there and go, well, we don't know, so God did it. I talk about what I think the properties of whatever caused the beginning of the universe are consistent with the properties that we typically apply to a deity. And however, I don't just say, well, I don't know, so God did it. But if I did just say, well, I don't know, so God did it, how's that any better than, well, I don't know, so I'm going to throw in imaginary numbers, which are pretty much meaningless. So other than that, we're going to open up to whatever you guys want to talk about. So we'll go back to back earlier in the chat, and after the technical problems seem to resolve. Let's see. And yes, Gorilla says the CIA must be done hacking my computer. That's why the stream is working now. Oh, darn those CIA people. Robert says shalom today. Shalom, shalom, Robert. Hope you are well. And then Gorilla says, so we had a weird discussion the other day. So if a person is widowed and remarries and then all three die, would it just be a big old threesome in heaven? Well, no. I mean, that's actually answered in the Bible directly. You may not be aware of this, Gorilla, but yes, almost that exact scenario is in the Bible. Let's see. All right, and so let me go to that passage right now. So it's Matthew 22. And I'll be honest with you, it's one of those passages that makes some people very uncomfortable. And it raises some questions that some people don't like to think about. But quite frankly, I still think it's interesting, and I don't think that we need to get all worked up about that kind of stuff. But let's switch screens, and we'll read up on what you were talking about here. All right, so this is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. It's kind of funny since Life with Matthew, but yeah, this is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, starting at verse 23. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection. So let me pause there for a second. The Sadducees, not to be confused with the Pharisees, were a group of religious leaders 2,000 years ago. And ideologically speaking, they were different than the Pharisees. And it's kind of funny. It's kind of like different sects today, but this is kind of a serious difference of opinion. The Pharisees basically believed in what we call today the Old Testament. They believed that was the Holy Scripture. The Sadducees took a much more narrow focus on things. They felt that only the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, they thought that was it. There was, in fact, nothing else. And because there is really no talk of afterlife or resurrection or anything like that in those first 5 books of the Bible, there's not a lot of it in the Old Testament at all, but there's nothing in the books of Moses. One of the ideological doctrines of the Sadducees was that, kind of like an atheist, once you're dead, you're dead. That's it. You get one life to live, and then it's over. So they did not believe in a resurrection and judgment and all that. They just believed that you live your life and you die. They did believe God was real, but they didn't believe that anything happens to us after death other than non-existence. So that's important to take into context here. So the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question, him being Jesus. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Remember, we talked about that in our Leviticus study. Having sexual relations with your brother's wife is a sin, but if your brother dies and she has no children, then you are obligated to marry her so that she can have offspring that would become your brother's heir. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and then died. Since she had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third brother, right down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the seven, since all of them were married to her? So you see, Gorilla, this is almost the exact same question. I mean, obviously without the, rather crass statement of having threesomes, but but you get the idea. And by the way, you want to get into that a little bit more in a silly and very non-biblical way, I highly recommend the movie Eternity that just came out. The wife and I saw that, and it's basically about when a woman dies and she has two ex-husbands that are waiting for her on the other side, and then she has to choose who to spend eternity with. So, interesting movie. Anyway, so who was married to her since all seven of them were married to her? Jesus replied, "You are in error." Sounds like something from Star Trek. Because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. Now, what's interesting here is that he says you do not. Remember, he's talking to the Sadducees. So he's telling them you don't know the scriptures because they don't believe that anything past the books of Moses are scripture at all. So they don't believe in any of the books of the prophets. They don't believe in any of the books of wisdom. They don't think any of that is scripture. Instead, they think it's just the historical texts of the settling of Israel. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, that's where people get a little squeamish and awkward about it. So, what does that mean exactly? This is why, like, some people would put forth the idea that angels are like hermaphrodites or something. There's nothing about that in the Bible. It's just people suggest that because it's saying that they will not marry nor be given in marriage. However, if you go back to the Old Testament, when it's apparent, at least, and I know there's differing opinions on it, that prior to the Noah's flood, that angels were taking human women as wives, and this was an affront to God. So it seems possible that angels are at least capable of that kind of a relationship, but that it was, for whatever reason, either forbidden or just, you know, well, it was straight up forbidden, at least for an angel to have a relationship with a human in that sense. However, there is zero, and I mean zero talk in the Bible about the sexual habits of angels, right? Other than the fact that some angels apparently took human women as wives. That's the only mention of angels and their sexuality. But I think that what it's saying here is that post resurrection, the concept of marriage, and keep in mind that the concept of marriage from a biblical standpoint is that a man or a woman on their own is incomplete. And so that's why when it came to Adam, he said that it was not good that he was alone. So that the concept of the two joining and becoming one flesh, literally a very graphic and yet romantic vision of what the marital sexual relation is supposed to be. But the two becoming one flesh is a completion, if you will, that only during that time is is the human truly complete. Which would also explain why that is probably the most awesome thing that there is. So, once we are in paradise, we are no longer, it would at least, it doesn't say it directly, but it would kind of infer this from some of this, as well as other things that are in like Revelation and stuff. We are no longer really incomplete. And partially because we are in direct fellowship with God Himself, and so that means, as wonderful as the time of the two becoming one flesh is, that becomes the norm in paradise. So if that's true, then that type of having an entire relationship centered around that act would no longer be a necessity, because you would always basically feel that good. And if that's the case, man, heaven sounds really awesome. But the main thing to take out of this is not, because that's all speculation as far as what life in paradise would truly be like. But I think the main thing to take from this is that on the other side, that marriage as we know it does not exist. Does that mean there will be no sexual relations whatsoever? Don't know. Doesn't say, right? Some people say yes, but it'll be more like the hippies wanted it, where everybody just like does it with whomever, whenever they want to. Or some people say no, kind of like what I was just suggesting, is that because just existing in paradise is so incredibly fulfilling that the a sexual relationship no longer becomes a fulfillment of anything, because you're already feeling that good or even better. What the truth is, honestly, I don't think we'll know until we're on the other side. But I think those are both strong possibilities. But in any case, what Christ does make clear here is that marriage, as we know it, does not exist on the other side. So, no, it means that if a person, and notice, by the way, another thing to keep in mind, Gorilla, is that if you ever listen to, like my wife and I, when we got married, and it's kind of funny because the minister that married us was kind of hesitant about doing this, because he is a very liberal Christian. In fact, now I wouldn't even call him a Christian, because he's become a universalist. But the reverend that married us, we used the traditional wedding vows, which, like I say, he wasn't a big fan of, but that means that my wife pledged to honor and obey, and I pledged to love and cherish, and all that. But the final part of those vows, which everybody has heard a million times, is until death do we part, right? Well, what that means, and what people don't think about, that literally means is that the contract that is created in marriage, the union, is dissolved when one of the two parties dies. And so that's why, if you are married, it doesn't matter if you're married for 6 months or 60 years. If you're married and your spouse dies and then you remarry, that is in no way, shape, or form a sin. And in fact, depending on the individual, it can, it's highly encouraged. If Because some people absolutely need that partnership. And in fact, it's kind of funny because statistically, there's studies in psychiatry that show this. Men who truly deeply love their wives tend to remarry extremely quickly after their wives pass away. Why? Because the absence of that partner is such a hole that they have to fill it, right? And so, but there's nothing at all sinful about marrying someone else after your partner dies. You know, as long as you're not murdering your partner, I suppose, in order to get to that marriage. The only time it would become sinful is if you, and I do know people that have done this as well, and it's the wrong line of thinking, is you get married, your partner dies, and so then you hook up with somebody and you just like live together, or you're friends with benefits or whatever, because you're like, I did the whole marriage thing. And it's like, no, that is sinful. So you need to be very, very careful about what is biblical and okay and what is not. Biblically speaking, you marry, your spouse dies, that marriage is now over. It does not carry over into paradise, right? That's why the contract says till death do you part, because at death it's over. Then you can marry somebody else. And if you marry 25 people in this life because you were very, very unlucky and you had 24 people die on you, if you marry 25 people in your life, well, when you get to the other side in paradise, you might meet them, you might be friends with them. Who knows? We don't know exactly what everything's going to be like over there. But you will not be married to them. That is painfully clear. So that was an extraordinarily long-winded answer, Gorilla, but you brought up something that has a direct biblical answer, so I figured it makes sense to explore that a little bit. Robert says, just like last night's TOS episode was tomorrow's yesterday, how are they able to predict the first man-moon mission years before it happened? Well, that's kind of funny because, yes, the tomorrow is yesterday, and they did it with very slim timing because, let's see, let me see. Yeah, so tomorrow is yesterday. Aired January 26th, 1967, right? So there was only 3 years left, almost exactly 3 years left in the 1960s, right? However, although I think, is that the one you're thinking of, or is it? Well, yeah, they were talking about it, I think, on the radio chatter. Because the radio guy said, "Oh yeah, they're getting ready to try to do the first man moonshot," and Kirk said, "Man moonshot? That was in the late 1960s." And Spock's answer was, "Well, apparently, Captain, so are we." Dun dun dun. Time travel, and so they predicted that within 3 years of that air date, and actually within 2 years and 11 months, if you want to get technical, within 2 years and 11 months of that air date of January 26, 1967, that we would have our first successful man moonshot. And of course, lo and behold, on July 20th, 1969, a date that, despite the fact that I was extraordinarily young, I remember like it was yesterday. But on July 20th, 1969, is when Neil Armstrong and his gang landed on the moon. And so, you know, 2 years after that episode aired, 2 years and a few months, it actually happened. And so I think that's amazing, right? But it doesn't make him psychic. It just means because the Apollo program was well into development at the time, and the whole goal of the Apollo program was to land somebody on the moon before the end of the 1960s. So basically, Star Trek just made the guess that they would be successful. I saw a can of hydrogen infused water. Okay. And Bradley says splitting atoms goes badly. Well, it depends. Yeah, we do it all the time. Well, actually, it's not splitting atoms. We split particles in like the Large Hadron Collider. Splitting atoms, of course, gives us nuclear fission, not to be confused with nuclear fusion. And honestly, our big nuclear weapons today are nuclear fusion bombs, not fission bombs. And fusion is the opposite of splitting atoms, it's merging atoms. But the excess particles that are distributed off of the atom are then converted into energy and hence big explosion. What about hydrogen? Wouldn't it just be without any hydrogen, wouldn't it just be a bottle of oxygen? Well, yeah. If you separate hydrogen and oxygen from the water, yeah, you know, a can of air. Though still not manned space, so still no manned space probe to Saturn yet. Yeah, that is true. But the remember, according to tomorrow's yesterday, Captain Christopher's son would be the first guy to go to Saturn, and his son would have been born right around the same time as me, based on the air date, because it was January 1967. He had no son. Obviously, at least at the time, his wife was not pregnant, or at least not to his knowledge, which means the very earliest his son could be born would be at the very end of 1967, or more likely into spring of 1968, which would be, well, me, since I was born in the spring of 1968. And there's Thomas saying that Matthew left me a message. Thank you, Thomas. I did, in fact, read the message and respond to it. And good to see you, by the way. Stan says he got on his bike and hasn't been seen since yet. He's just out there running. When Matthew passes away, he's going to be in paradise running down old ladies on his bike. Matthew has mentioned a few times during his Babylon 5 stream that he would like to start the virtual pub with Salty Trekker again. Well, I would be more than happy to join him in the virtual pub. And I actually just responded to him as such, because that's what his message was about. So I would love to do the virtual pub with Matthew. We'll just figure out a way to do it. Street Preach says, I barely got through high school advanced math. Don't think we got to imagine. No, imaginary numbers is pretty high up the math chain. You're beyond like standard algebra and stuff by the time you get to imaginary numbers. And it's not, like I said, I understand, like imaginary numbers help you solve certain mathematical equations, which is great for math. But when you start using things like that to predict real world things, and this is the interesting thing about it though, can imaginary numbers be used to accurately predict real things in the real world? Yes, to a point. But we still are just using it as a cheat because we haven't really figured it out yet. So if we're using imaginary numbers to describe something, like imaginary numbers are used in quantum mechanics and stuff like that. But if you use imaginary numbers in order to predict things using your theory, all that means is that your theory is definitely not complete. Just like if you use infinity. You have to marry her even though they didn't already have kids. Yes, that is an absolute requirement. So it is. And now, this is not a requirement for us today, but for the Jews, it absolutely is a part of their law. And it's because you have to consider take into account cultural context. So, like today, it really wouldn't matter as much. But culturally, women were not technically allowed to own property 2,000 years ago in Israel. So instead, what would happen? So if a woman's husband died, then his heir would own the property, right? So if the husband had a little bit of land, a house, maybe some sheep and some goats or whatever, all that would go to his heir. His heir would be primary, his firstborn son would get a double portion, and then any other sons would get a single portion of everything that he had. Now, women were not heirs in that sense. Instead, women, and some people say, oh, that's so horrible and sexist. In some ways, you can make that case because women not being allowed to own property is definitely, I would say, in the modern context, that would be a bad thing to a point. Because it's also in their culture that women are to be taken care of. And so, if that's one of the reasons. Like, remember, one of the Ten Commandments is to honor your mother and your father. That means that when if your dad dies, and you are the eldest son, you are 100% obligated to then take care of your mother. And so you are to provide everything she needs. And so it's not like we just throw the women out just because they're not their husband dies. All that being said, well, what if she doesn't have a son? Where does his property go? And so and that that's a whole other discussion, but it would go to brothers or something like that. Just like real estate property today. Typically in the United States, if a spouse dies, the other spouse gets it. If there's no other spouse, then their children gets it. If there's no children, then their next closest, like a sibling or their parents or anybody who might still be alive, right? So it basically they just look at the chain of next of kin, assuming there's no will. If you leave a will, you can delegate who gets it. But if you don't leave a will, then it goes to the closest next of kin. If there is no next of kin, your property just becomes property of the state. So, but women were to be cherished, were to be taken care of. And so people think, oh, it's so terrible, it's so sexist. Yeah, it's so sexist to have an entire society dedicated to taking care of you. That's terrible. But at any rate, but if a woman had no male children and the husband dies, then that means that the person who is going to inherit it, most likely a brother, because most families had more than one son, but it would most likely be a brother. And if he had no brothers, it would probably be his sister's husband or something like that. But if that person would not be obligated to take care of the mother, and so, or of the wife, I mean, and so that would leave her out in the proverbial cold. And so the law basically said, well, if she doesn't have a male child, that and but she does, her spouse had a brother, then the brother is then obligated, even if he is married, to at the very least be with her until she conceives a son. Once she has a son, then they don't have to be married any longer, and it's but because the son is now the heir to the property, and so the son, and by the way, the firstborn son of that union would always take on her original spouse's name, and so that would be considered his heir, even though he didn't biologically conceive her because he was dead. I figured it was only if there were kids, so it would be someone to raise them. No, because if she had, let's say she had a son, but the son was only, like a year old or something. Well, by Jewish law at the time, the year old son would own the property. But since he was only a year old, until he reached the age of, oh gosh, what's it called? Where the age of responsibility or age of accountability, which is typically like in the Jewish tradition today would be when you would have your bar mitzvah. Then the until you reach that age, then the woman would make decisions for her son, but it would still be his property. And then once he became a man, once he had his bar mitzvah, his primary obligation would be to provide for his mother. Let's see. Darth Smack. I don't know if I've met you before. Says God is real and Donald Trump is good. Well, I will agree with you on at least half of that statement. Street Preacher says, so if you're expected to procreate with your dead brother's wife, if they didn't have children yet, yes. Particularly, you are expected to procreate with her until she has a son. That was the law. That whole movie could have been done in 5 minutes if they all picked the same eternity. Yeah, but then it wouldn't have been a movie. Figure she'd just become a free agent again. No, it doesn't work that as far as you're talking about in the ancient Jewish culture. No, and the thing is that like theoretically she could be, but the big question there is not so that she has a sexual partner. It's so that the property stays in the family proper and that she is taken care of. And so her brother, or I mean, her husband must have an heir. It is the absolute primary duty in marriage what is the first commandment of God? To be fruitful and multiply. And that means, in as far as property is concerned, you must have at least one son. I'm kidding, or am I? I don't know, but I still only agree with half of your statement. Nomad versus the Borg. That's an interesting one because, of course, Nomad fires bolts that are the equivalent of 90 photon torpedoes. You heard that correctly, 90. And in addition, I think it would be extraordinarily difficult to assimilate Nomad, but I don't think necessarily impossible. What's interesting is that Nomad shows qualities of both mechanical and biological. I mean, Spock was able to mind meld with Nomad, which is interesting. If the Borg could assimilate Nomad, that would be very bad news for everybody because even the Borg's weaponry isn't quite that powerful. So if it was a one-off battle, like A Cube versus Nomad, here's the question: would Nomad want to sterilize the Borg? I don't know that he would. In fact, it's entirely possible. Just thinking about it, Nomad may willingly join the collective because he may see the collective. Remember, what's the collective's ultimate purpose? To become perfect. What is Nomad's ultimate purpose? To seek out perfect life forms. There is no life form more perfect in Nomad's relentless judgment than the Borg. So I think that Nomad versus the Borg may in fact be a misnomer. I don't think that there would be a conflict, and Nomad would willingly join the collective, which would be really bad news for everybody. 24 women that just died tragically in accidents. Yes. If you married 25 people who died, the FBI would be looking into you. That's true. You better have a good alibi for every single one of those deaths. I mean, maybe you just happened to marry 24 people in a row. What if you're a nurse at the cancer ward and you just keep falling in love with your patients? You know, and you want them to die happy, so you marry them when they only have 6 months to live. I mean, that could be a way. I turned around and I guess just slipped off the edge of that cliff. Yeah, that would be bad. I was laughing at that. What is your opinion on the gap theory? Well, which specific gap theory you're talking about is there's some interesting ideas. So, the most common version of the gap theory is that there's this huge gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and I believe Genesis 1:2. Let me go there real quick so I can make sure that I'm talking about the right verses. But Yes. So, yes, between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that there is a huge gap of time. So let's go there right now. So, Genesis 1:1, very first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very simple, straightforward statement, right? So, God created the heavens and the earth is long form poetic language for God created the universe, right? Verse 1 2. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So, in verse 1 2, and I'll tell you, I think there's a problem with the gap theory, but I want to get into it a little bit here. Verse 1 2, notice it starts with now. So the suggestion in the gap theory is that so in the beginning God created the universe. Fast forward 14 billion years. Now God was, hovering over the earth and started creating life and all that, right? And so basically the idea of the gap theory is that the bulk of cosmic history takes place in between verses 1:1 and 1:2. It's a sound and logical idea until you read verse 1 3. Because verse 1 3 says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." And now, notice he then says, God saw the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness, he called night. Now, here's where we get into some divisiveness within the church. And this is divisiveness that doesn't, it's okay to have different ideas about this. It's not a salvation issue, whether or not you believe that the gap theory between verse 1 1 and 1 2 is true, or whether you believe what I'm about to suggest is true. It doesn't matter. Okay? It really, really doesn't matter as far as your salvation. So I want that perfectly clear. I'm not saying you have to agree with me on this. But in verse 3 is the creation of light itself. That, to me, is the event that we call the Big Bang. Which means that verse 1 1 and 1 2 are actually prior to the expansion of the universe. How is that possible, right? Well, in fact, in some weird ways, we can go back to things like the Hawking-Hartle idea and stuff like that. Is that if if the universe, as we know it, existed in some kind of stable, maybe even cool state in a very, very small amount of space. And that could, in fact, be where we see the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. That could easily, keep in mind that modern cosmological concepts that we have today about space and time and their relation and all that, that kind of stuff did not exist when this was written, right? And it wouldn't make sense for God to start describing things in terms of the Big Bang Theory here, because, or even the Hartle-Hawking proposal or something, because nobody would have understood it, right? It would have just sounded like nonsense. But if we replace, or keep in mind, the word Earth, as translated here, means a lot of different things, right? And so in fact, let's take a look at the actual word. All right. So the word Earth, and you'll see it pops up a lot, is Eries, right? And so if we click on that word, you'll see world, earth, all inhabited lands, parts of earth, land, contrast to water, ground, soil, country, region, territory, the totality of creation, very distant place, land, etc. So, Eries doesn't necessarily, I mean, yes, the word means earth, but it means a lot of different things there. And what if we're simply looking at the wrong interpretation of that word? What if instead of saying the earth was formless and empty, what if it said the universe was formless and empty? Right? When it says darkness was over the surface of the deep, a lot of people take that and further that it says that God was hovering over the waters. People take that as to mean like the Earth was a wet planetoid covered in water, and God was literally hovering over it, thinking about, what am I going to do with this wet blob of planet? And then he starts his work, right? That we get into in the following verses. But what if the deep described here is not necessarily talking about the oceans of the planet as much as the depths of the universe itself? And hovering over the waters, well, keep in mind that even later on in this very passage, when it describes God creating the sky and the oceans, is that He separates the waters from the waters, and the waters above it was. Oh, let's go there. Let's see. Here we go. Verse 6, God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made a vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And so it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. So the sky is described as a vault that separates water from water. And what is that water? And water, it's, I mean, if you want to take the water as being a literal description, it's the oceans of the earth and outer space, right? And the vault is the atmosphere, right? Which separates the oceans from outer space. And that, it's a very poetic way of describing things. But again, what if, when it says earlier on that God was hovering over the waters, which is the word mayim, and notice God separated the vault, water from water, mayim and mayim, the water under the vault, mayim, the water over the vault, mayim, all using the same word. So the word that's used to describe outer space is the same word that is the word used to describe God hovering over the waters in verse 2. So I would submit, this is a very long-winded, description of biblical cosmology, but I would submit that verses 1 and 2 was God looking at the primordial universe that is the universe prior to expansion, as Hawking Hartle might describe it, or anybody else that wants to try to describe like the quantum vacuum, if you will, right? And which I also think is very interesting, because if this is true, this fits even better with modern physics than just saying the Big Bang Theory, right? But if God is hovering over what we would call the quantum vacuum today, and then He says, "Let there be light," there's your fluctuation that causes expansion. And for anybody that doesn't know, based on physics, the first few seconds of the existence of the universe was so hot that nothing physical that we understand could exist except possibly pure radiation. In other words, pure light. So the earliest universe was composed entirely of photons. But that's just a very fancy way of saying there was nothing but light. So, all that to say, what do I think of the gap theory? I think it's an interesting idea, but I think it's fundamentally flawed because it doesn't take into account verse 3, and I think there's a better explanation of things. The problem with my explanation, and I'm certainly not above, any kind of real criticism of my ideas here. The problem with my interpretation of these things is that it requires a an interpretation of Genesis that some people don't like to accept, which is that things like the word yom, day, does not necessarily mean a 24-hour day. It could mean an extended period of time, and that some of the language is more symbolic than most people tend to think. And some things are based on perhaps slight misinterpretations, like the idea of what Earth is in verse 2 doesn't necessarily mean planet Earth. So I'd love to see what you think of all that. They've been working on it for a while. When did Kennedy give the moon speech? Yeah, well, Kennedy was long dead by the time that episode aired. So yes, the the idea of the Apollo moon mission had been well underway by the time that episode aired. Kennedy did his moon speech in 1962, land before the end of the decade, and then 1980, say it's Thomas, and they made it within 5 months with 5 months to spare. Yes, they did. Well, don't they have a small fission reaction to produce a fusion explosion? Yes. The fission, it's kind of funny because, yeah, when you talk about modern nuclear weapons, so a fission bomb, the bomb dropped in Hiroshima was a fission bomb, right? They use explosives, like pretty standard explosives, to trigger the fission reaction. In a fusion bomb, they actually use fission explosives to trigger the fusion reaction. So that should give you an idea of just how powerful these bombs actually are. We need to get rid of these dihydrogen oxide because it kills thousands of people a year. Well, it's true that 100% of people who die have had dihydrogen oxide within, just days before they die. It's true. 100%. And I mean, so yeah. V'ger Cloud versus the Borg fleet, we see the beginning of Scorpion Part 1. That's an interesting one. So, I don't remember exactly. There's something in the order of like 15 Borg cubes in that fleet that we see. And by the way, that was such a butt puckering moment in Star Trek history when that fleet showed up. But that is at that point in Star Trek history the most powerful fleet of ships we'd ever seen. Now, the V'ger Cloud is a singular ship that is somewhat larger than a Borg cube, but the question then becomes, and this is really the trick here: can V'ger basically encode, if you will, all the Borg ships before they reach V'ger at the center of the cloud? I don't know the answer to that because we have a couple of interesting problems to solve. We know that the Borg have a tendency to, what they do is that they'll take a hit from something and then very quickly, and people underestimate how quickly, particularly the Borg we see in Q, the Borg very quickly adapt to whatever form of attack they got hit with. And so, for example, in the case of the Borg drone in engineering, Worf shoots the drone dead with a phaser. Then, literally maybe 2-3 seconds later, another drone beams in with shields that are precisely adapted to repel phaser fire. So so just because a Borg dies doesn't necessarily disqualify it from adaptation, especially since there's a whole fleet of Borg ships. Now, from what we've seen of V'ger, it would appear that V'ger can only fire one of its torpedoes at a time, and it can't fire them in rapid succession. We saw that in both the battle with the Klingon ships and when it attacked the Enterprise. Remember, the Enterprise took a hit and then it fired another torpedo. And in the time between the hit and the other torpedo, Spock was able to come up with a way to communicate with V'ger. And so, if you have a good solid minute or so between firings, and there's 15 Borg ships, that means you have 15 opportunities to adapt and at least 15 minutes to penetrate the cloud to reach the center. Once the Borg reach the center, once they actually, if they get a cube to V'ger, it's over. Because all you need is to beam some drones over to V'ger. One drone, and V'ger doesn't, at least from all appearances, V'ger doesn't seem to have internal security of any kind. And so one drone reaches the Voyager space probe and sticks out its tubules, it's over. So I think that, in all honesty, the Borg have the distinct edge there. I'm trying to cut down on oxygen. Now that's the real killer. That's another thing that's 100% true. Is that one? You realize 100, not lying, 100% of people who die have ingested oxygen within 3 minutes of their death. 3 minutes. Oxygen kills that quickly. We need to stamp it out. I watched the other day the Decker shadow reveal of Time Cop. He did mention several scientific principles during the review, particularly the Einstein's theory that says time traveling to the past is virtually impossible, that travel into the future is more likely. Also, that the same matter can occupy the same matter can occupy the same space and time. That's one's physical matter and constantly changing. So all these TV shows and movies that have time travel to the past is not possible according to Einstein. Okay, so a lot there, but so I don't remember. I haven't watched Time Cop in a while. Fun movie, but I haven't watched it in a while. So I don't remember the technobabble talk about time travel as far as what they said. So as far as relativistic time travel, that's where you that's really in the theory of special relativity. His first theory is that's where we get the idea of time dilation from. That the if you accelerate to speeds approaching the speed of light, then your passage through time slows down in comparison to wherever it is that you left from. So if you leave Earth and you go at nearly the speed of light and you're gone for a year and then you turn around and you come back, when you come back, say a year or maybe two have passed for you, but depending on how close to the speed of light, anywhere from 10 years to thousands of years have gone by on Earth, right? The closer you get to the speed of light, the more time will have gone by. Now, this is where you come up with limitations of the mathematics, where even Einstein, who was a true genius, basically, this is where relativity kind of breaks down. Because in order to have a theory that you could say reliably, this is an accurate description of the universe, it has to not ever break down, right? And unfortunately, relativity does, because if you take the variable t, meaning time, like how quickly you are going through time, and t as a number. So I'm doing a simplistic idea of it, but let's say your perspective on time is p, right? How fast you're going through time. And so P equals, say, 1 times T. So if you're on Earth, and we'll just say on Earth, time equals 1. We're going, at whatever perspective. So on Earth, T equals 1. As you accelerate closer to the speed of light, T gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is what causes time dilation. So if you get to the point where T equals, you know, point, point 0.5, right? Then that means that if you're gone for 1 month and you come back, 2 months will have gone by on Earth. It doesn't mean that you feel like this. It means that when you look around, everything seems normal. But if you were to look back at Earth and observe it in real time while you're doing this, everything would appear to be moving at double speed. Meanwhile, on Earth, you look around, everything looks normal, but you look at on the spaceship, and everything seems to be moving at half speed. So it's a matter of perspective. So as you accelerate further and further, you get your t equals less and less and less. So where does it break down? Well, it breaks down once you reach the actual speed of light, because at c, speed of light, then t equals 0, which means that you would literally experience no time, and you could traveling. It's almost like how they described warp 10, right? Because if t equals 0, you could travel to every point in the universe simultaneously, and it would take 0 time. So that's obviously a logical absurdity, but we as far as what little, because we can't get speeds even nearly approaching c, which is 300,000 meters per second, or yeah, roughly, or is it kilometers? 300,000 kilometers per second. It's 186,000 miles per second. I can remember that one easier. So at 186,000 miles per second is the speed of light, and we don't have anything even remotely close to that, because it takes us months just to cross to the nearest planet, right? And years to get to anything beyond Mars. And Voyager has been going since the 70s, and it's just left the solar system, right? So we don't have speeds anywhere near light speed. But the idea is, so we can only test it to a certain point. We have been able to demonstrate time dilation, but the amount of time dilation we've demonstrated is in the nanosecond range, right? It's incredibly tiny. But if we could accelerate more, if we could get ships that approach the speed of light, and would Einstein bear out? We don't really know. We've only been able to test it on the smaller scales, but you know, it doesn't make sense. It seems that t would ever equal 0 in any meaningful way. And if there was a particular speed that where t equals 0, then that means that and that's where people get into mathematics versus reality. Well, what if you go beyond that? Well, if the faster you're going, the lower t is, and there's a speed where t equals 0, then if you go faster than that, then t would be a negative number, right? That's just mathematically true. And that's where you would actually go backwards in time, is if you could accelerate to beyond light speed. The problem with that is that everything in relativistic physics says that nothing can travel faster than light. Now, is there a reason nothing can travel faster than light, other than the mathematics kind of breaks down? Honestly, that's the main thing, is mathematics breaks down when you hit light speed. So that's why they say only light can go as fast as light. In fact, even when we try to accelerate things to the speed of light, so we take electrons, put them in the Large Hadron Collider, and some people assume electrons move at light speed. They don't. They move up to like 0.999995 of light speed, if I remember correctly, something like that. And so if electrons are going that, electrons can't achieve in the Large Hadron Collider. We can't get to light speed. We can get very close. We can't get them to light speed. And the same is true of anything we've ever been able to practically demonstrate. Then maybe it's true. Nothing can go faster than light. Maybe nothing can actually hit light speed except light itself. Why? We haven't quite pieced that together yet. I have my own ideas on it, but I'm not going to say that here. And no, it's not God did it. Oxygen is poisonous. It just takes 70 to 80 years to kill you. Yeah, and it kills everybody. Make a joke a jester would make. You know what? I don't know. I'm not a jester, and I've never actually seen a actual jester. Exactly. That's why I'm trying to give it up. Give up oxygen. Yeah, it's hard though. Here's the problem. Everybody's also addicted to oxygen, and they're so addicted to oxygen that without it they will die. Well, cigarettes help filter it out. They definitely reduce it. If Michael looked like a woman, he would make a cute member of the Lollipop Guild. Except I'm 6'1". I would not make a good member of the Lollipop Guild. Well, of course, if it was in Wicked, I would, because they're just normal height for some reason. Yes, but you need to smoke them continually. Yes, that would be true. What is Michael going to eat for Christmas? Probably turkey, to be honest, because we don't have money to buy a roast. What we like to do on Christmas is to have like a rib roast. It's my favorite meal of the year. However, this year we can't really afford it, and we have a turkey in the freezer, so we'll probably eat that. And Grillo says, if I was 20 and some rich 75-year-old wants to marry me, I'm game only to have to put up with them for a couple of years before I inherit everything. Wow, nice to see where your priorities are. Jigsaw Killer versus the Collector. If you're talking about the Collector from Guardians of the Galaxy, the Collector in the comics is like this super powerful cosmic being. In Guardians of the Galaxy, we don't really see him do much, but I would still probably have to give it to him because even if he's not a cosmic being like in the comics, he has access to technology that Jigsaw would have no counter for. Taskmaster versus Batman. Well, that's happened a few times in the comics. Not Taskmaster but actually, I think in crossovers it might have. But the problem with Taskmaster versus Batman is that Taskmaster can replicate the fighting forms of anybody and everybody. And that would include Batman, which means that if fighting Batman, it would learn all the martial arts and execute them perfectly, just as Batman does. Further, if Taskmaster Taskmaster would definitely lose their first encounter because one thing that Taskmaster would not have readily available is a utility belt with all the nifty bells and whistles that Batman keeps in his utility belt. However, their second encounter, Taskmaster would in fact have a utility belt to match Batman's and still have Taskmaster's signature shield, which would give Taskmaster a distinct edge. So I think that first fight definitely goes to Batman. Subsequent fights will probably go to Taskmaster. The word earth comes from Germanic for ground. And that's the thing. Well, yeah, we use, in fact, if you've ever worked in a ranch or a farm, like when I grew up, you would refer to it as working the earth, as far as that's what gardening was. But people forget that it doesn't necessarily just mean the planet that we live on, but it also is a direct reference to soil. But the word Aries that is used in Genesis also can refer to all of creation. And so, if that is the case, it's even though we don't use the word Earth that way, that is a possible definition of Aries, and so that could very much change the meaning of verse 2. Michael, think of alternate reality where you're a woman. Why? Decker's Shadow is one of the few YouTube movies and TV show reviewers and critics that at times include scientific principles in some of his reviews. That's cool. I've never heard of that particular YouTuber. But in fact, let me go there now because I don't want to forget. Let's see. It's called Decker Shadow. All right, Decker Shadow. Wow, a lot of subscribers there at Decker Shadow. And so that he looks almost like Thunderfoot. I don't know who that is. His old videos, man, he looks very different than he does now. His newer videos, he looks like Thunderfoot. His old videos, he doesn't, which was back when I was talking to Thunderfoot. He doesn't look anything like him, but that's funny. I will check it out. Still working through the sexuality thing, it seems. I think it might be impure to be picturing Salty as a woman. I think it's just weird because I would not make a good woman. I learned all that from watching Oppenheimer. Well, if you learn your physics from movies, you are learning bad physics. I'm sorry. There are some movies that do it better than others, but movies, at the very least, movies have to abbreviate physical concepts. And don't get me wrong, I understand that. What I don't like is that in science fiction, so often physics are just kind of broken and nobody cares. Now, in some cases, like, look, I get that. Yeah, if you're going to have anything that doesn't take place in our solar system, then you're going to need some kind of faster than light travel. And while there are interesting theoretical ideas on how one might be able to break the light barrier, if you will, it's not been done, and so it's a cheat. No matter whether you're talking about hyperdrive or warp drive or wormhole drive or whatever, it's all a cheat because there's no known way to do it right now. That being said, for a storytelling device, that's fine. And there are some cases where things are surprisingly accurate, but nobody thinks about it. So, for example, in my favorite episode of all of Star Trek, The Balance of Terror, the Romulans fire a plasma weapon that does devastating damage, but only when it's close. The further you go, the weaker the weapon gets. And what's interesting is that Kirk even makes a comment, not that, oh, it has a particularly short range. No, just that it has a limited range. Why? Because phasers and photon torpedoes do not really have a practical range limit. It's just harder to aim when they get further away. Typically, what we've seen in canon is that locking a phaser on target, which means a guaranteed hit, basically can be done at distances in the original series of around 100 to 200,000 kilometers, and same with photon torpedoes. But even without a phaser lock, you can fire forever. The phaser just goes on for all eternity until it hits something, which kind of makes you wonder what happens to those phaser beams that miss occasionally. But Kirk was shocked that the plasma weapon had a limited range. And then I talked to a friend of mine who happens to be a physicist about plasma, and it would be an accurate thing that a plasma weapon would naturally dissipate the further it traveled. And so it's absolutely true that a plasma torpedo, while it may do a massive amount of damage, would slowly dissipate as it flies towards its target, which means that the further away you are, the less damage it's going to do. So that's actually really surprisingly accurate stuff. It's just that the thing about the original series that I really liked and appreciated is that the original series didn't resort to technobabble to try and explain it. They just said, hey, they're firing their weapon. Hey, their weapon doesn't work at long range. They don't, and they established earlier that it appears to be some kind of plasma-based weapon. That's all they need. And that's good science fiction, as opposed to the kind of crap you hear on Voyager. Anytime Taurus opens her mouth on Voyager, she's saying some scientific nonsense. And I really, really man, the time they cracked an Event Horizon just broke me. And that's early in season one. Someone with a piece of wood versus someone with a newspaper. Well, while knowledge is power, newspapers provide knowledge. Wood is more likely to cause a concussion, so I'll give it to the person with wood. Spielberg's Duel, is that considered a horror movie? Well, it's a made-for-TV horror movie, and if I remember, I don't remember if it's Spielberg's first or one of his first films. It definitely has some horror elements, but I would say it's more of a suspense thriller than a straight up horror movie. But it is a darn good one. And is Jaws even classified as horror? Generally, yes. Jaws is considered horror. Remember, Jaws is at its heart a monster movie. And monster movies are a subgenre of horror, going all the way back to Frankenstein and Dracula. Right, monster movies is just about some kind of supernatural beast or person or creature that is preying upon us poor innocent humans. And in Jaws, while a great white shark in and of itself is not necessarily supernatural, the shark in Jaws definitely shows qualities that are beyond that of normal sharks. We were in a heat wave. We went from negative 35 degrees while wind chills to being up to 22 degrees today. Time to pull out Speedo again. Well, yeah, you take a video of you walking around in Speedo. I want to see that. We are in the 20s today, and for us, that is pretty darn cold. Do you need gore for horror? Jaws had some deaths, but I don't think it was really so much of the attacks on or aftermath. There's some gore in Jaws. But do you have to have gore? Not necessarily. Horror is the difference between suspense and horror. They both have similar elements, but with good suspense, the point of the movie is to build a sense of unease and anticipation of the with the events going on screen, right? And suspense is used in every genre, but a true pure suspense film is something like Duel, where the entire movie, the point of it, is trying to figure out, this impending doom, the truck in Duel, and which is some kind of unstoppable force, and our hero has to figure out a way to overcome it. That's now in horror. It's generally unlike suspense, horror is generally a little more personal. Like horror is usually about the immediate danger to the characters themselves, as opposed to, like, even though Duel, there is that immediate danger factor, which is why Duel could be classified as a horror movie as well. In suspense films, it would be like, for example, a terrorist is planned, which, this happened in a bunch of movies. You talk about whether it's some of them are considered more actiony films and stuff. But if you look at a movie where, say, terrorists has planted a nuclear bomb where it's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people, and the hero has to figure out some way to figure out how to get to the nuclear bomb. If it's a well-made movie, throughout the movie we have the suspense of whether or not the hero will be successful in stopping the impending doom of the nuclear explosion. That builds suspense, as opposed to horror is if the main character is being basically attacked directly by whatever the antagonist of the story is. In the case of Jaws, the great white shark. In the case of Halloween, it's Michael Myers. It just depends on the individual movie as to what it is. And both horror uses a lot of suspense, but suspense in it as its own category is about the tension more than the vehicle of the tension. And whereas horror is about the vehicle of the tension and the threat to the protagonist. That's how I see it anyway. I believe Duel is a horror street preacher. Some movie reviewers, Duel said it's a different. Like I said, Duel is a very suspenseful horror film to me. But yeah, horror does not necessarily mean gore, but gore is more common in horror than pretty much any other genre. I would say that gore is overused in a lot of horror because they do it just for pure shock value. So instead of being about fear, gore porn, as it's sometimes referred, is about revulsion. That's not horror. Fahrenheit is silly. Is 22 still freezing? Yes. 32 is freezing point in Fahrenheit. License plate on the Dual truck were from past victims of the Dual truck driver. I'd never noticed that. But I haven't seen Duel in a long time, so maybe I did notice it and I just don't remember. Did it have a driver? Yeah, I didn't. Well, because I always confused Duel with The Car, which was like the predecessor of movies like Christine, because The Car was demonic. It was when the car blew up at the end. There was a huge devil face in the explosion. I don't remember in Duel if they ever showed the truck driver or not. I think they might actually. I think you do see the truck driver at some point. And yes, it did. The famed stunt driver, I forgot the name, did the driving of the dual truck. I always wanted to rent Maximum Carnage. That VHS cover is seared in my brain. Are you talking about Maximum Overdrive, maybe? I think it's the same plot, might even be early series. Well, Maximum Overdrive was Stephen King's, one of his attempts to write specifically a movie screenplay. So unlike there have been so many Stephen King short stories and novels that have been adapted into film. But Stephen King with Maximum Overdrive actually wrote a film, and most people think it's laughably bad. I've never seen it. Trek Review says, you're right about the Borg fleet being butt puckering. I remember the first time I saw that episode, I was watching it on 13-inch TV with poor sound, so I thought I heard that number wrong. Could you imagine if the Borg attacked the Federation with a fleet? TNG would be over. Yeah, absolutely. But notice the Borg, their modus operandi seems to be send one ship unless there's a genuine threat to the collective. And that's what Species 8472 was the first real threat that the Borg had faced in a very long time. And so that's why they started sending waves of ships after him. Imagine the. Oh, I already read that. Josiah says, ever played the Time Cop video game? I didn't even know there was a Time Cop video game until this moment. Does the movie ever show a person in the driver's seat? I think it does, but it's been so long I can't remember. We'll see. Let's see. Saw an interview with the guy with school accent. He mentioned the closer you get to the speed of light, the distances also seem to become shorter. Yeah, that's a weird thing too. Is that like if you have a spaceship that's 20 feet long, but you are approaching the speed of light, then from one observer, the spaceship is 20 feet long, and from another observer, the spaceship is like 18, 16, 10, however long it is, depending on the closer the speed of light it gets. Now, I think that there's a very good reason for that, and that reason has to do with the Doppler effect, basically affecting your perception of it. So I don't think that the ship, even though I know some, I get that a lot of purists, when they talk about relativity, they will say what I'm saying right now is blasphemy, but that's okay. I personally think that the ship is still like if you build a ship that's 20 feet long, that ship is 20 feet long. If you accelerate it and the appearance appears to scrunch, that's not because the ship has actually shrunk. It's because of the effect of light being compressed, and so it creates basically a very sophisticated optical illusion, depending on your perspective, which would also explain why two people with two different perspectives would see two different lengths of a spaceship. Let's see. But that's also like when you see the Enterprise go into warp speed in TNG, and it stretches as it goes. That's actually something that is it, you could argue would be a relatively accurate thing to do. In certain shots, you see the dual truck driver's hand and arm. That's what it was. Yeah, I vaguely remembered that. Like it's a shot from like over his shoulder, looking out the window, and you see his arm like turning the wheel or shifting gears or whatever. So you're traveling nearly the speed of light, but things hundreds of light years away. So even at that speed, it's not practical to visit. Actually, no. Well, this is the weird thing about time dilation. Assuming Einstein is correct at high speeds, which again we haven't tested, but everything indicates that it'll be true, is if you could go at like 99.95% of the speed of light, and you go to an say you're going to Rigel, which I believe is around 300 light years away. So you would think, well, if you're going 99% of the speed of light and it's 300 light years, it's going to take you 300 years, right? Wrong. And that's where it's actually very interesting the way that time dilation works. So if you are an observer on Earth watching the ship going to Rigel, the distance is 300 light years. The ship goes nearly the speed of light, and so it takes a little over 300 years for it to make its journey. And then another 300 years to come back. So 600 years in total as far as travel time. However, from the perspective of the person on the ship, depending on how close to the speed of light you get, the shorter the apparent time will be, which means that you could make it, if you go really, really close to the speed of light, you might make the trip in 6 days or 6 years. It just depends on how close to the speed of light you can push it. The closer you get to the speed of light, the closer to time equals zero, and that means that the shorter the amount of time it's going to take that trip. So for the person on the ship, if you could approach the speed of light in your ship, it's extremely practical to be able to travel all around the galaxy and even all around the universe, depending on how close to the speed of light you can get. The only downside is that by the time you get to Rigel, your grandchildren have died of old age, right? So, even though you may get there in a very brief amount of time, you're never going to see the people you know on Earth. But then those speeds, somehow the distances get closer, interstellar travel might actually, yeah, it would be absolutely practical for the person on the ship, but not for the people of Earth. And yes, that is all assuming we can accelerate close to the speed of light. And honestly, I think the big trick to that kind of acceleration is going to be what I think would be the next step in technological evolution. We really understand a thing when we master that thing. And, like, for example, electricity. Electricity is all around me, right? The computer I'm sitting in front of, the lights in this room, the heater that's blaring hot air, keeping T'Pring from freezing to death. Everything in this house runs on, except for, well, runs on gas, but runs on electricity. We have pretty well mastered the electron and electricity and electromagnetism. As a species, humanity has pretty good grasp of how it works, what it is, and how to use it for our benefit. So, when we figure out a way to do similar things with gravity, that's the big game changer. Because the problem with accelerating to the speed of light is not that it's not possible or even that it's particularly difficult to do. It's that we don't have the ability to create a ship with enough fuel to do it. Because currently to get massive amounts of acceleration, you need something like a rocket ship, right? Which burns, solid or liquid fuel in order to mass its propulsion. Well, if you had a rocket ship like the Apollo ships were just huge monstrosities, right? And if you tried to build a ship with enough solid or liquid fuel to accelerate it to even half of the speed of light, you would need a reserve of fuel that was trillions of gallons of fuel. And the problem is that the more fuel you have, the more mass you have to accelerate, which means you run into a big problem in that you're going to basically have too much mass. You're going to run into a limit where you keep having to add fuel to go more, but if you add that fuel, you're adding mass, and as you add the mass, it slows the ship down, so you can't go any faster, right? So that becomes a big problem. We have the best alternate form of acceleration that we have for spacecraft is the ion drive, which was named, interestingly enough, after Ion Drive from Star Trek: The Original Series. But ion drive is basically using a laser as a means of propulsion, because a laser is emitting light particles, and so just like anything, if you go back to Newtonian physics, any action produces an equal and opposite reaction. It's how thrust works. If you push out the back of your ship pushes forward with the same amount of force, right? And so the same is true whether you're pushing out the back exhaust from a rocket burn or particles of light from a laser. And so ion drive has one really big advantage, and that is that it can run off of simple electric power. Why is that such an advantage? Because you could build a ship that had a significant nuclear reactor as its core power, and that nuclear reactor could last hundreds of years with a very small amount of fuel in comparison to something like a rocket, right? So so if you used an ion drive, you could absolutely accelerate a ship too close to the speed of light. That's awesome. Here's the downside of ion drive is that the particle emission acceleration is so minute that it takes years and years and years of acceleration to get any kind of meaningful speed. And so it would not be a practical means of transportation for humans to take star travel, because to even approach the speed of light, if you're on your way to Betelgeuse or something, you're going to be halfway to the star before you are even getting anywhere near the speed of light. By that time, you got to start decelerating in order to keep from flying past it. So it's just not practical. As far it doesn't accelerate you fast enough. So if we figure out a way to harness and create gravitational fields, that's what would be the game changer. Because then what you could do is simply project a gravitational field in front of the spacecraft, and the spacecraft would fall into the gravitational field. And this would be its method of acceleration. And then once if you can accelerate at 9.2 meters per second squared, then that would, on the interior of the ship, it would feel like Earth normal gravity, and it would still take like a couple of years. I think it's like 4 years, remember, but you could reach speeds like 99 point whatever speed of the light. So a gravitational field drive would be the ultimate solution. And if you wanted to have bursts of harder acceleration, astronauts are used to massive acceleration. When a ship takes off, they experience multiple G's of gravity. And so you could actually, have periods of time where you had these multiple G's of acceleration. Let me see, what's the maximum that a human can take? Let's see. Max G force for human. All right, so maximum G force human can withstand varies from by duration, direction, and training, but average people tolerating 4 to 6 G's briefly. While trained fighter pilots manage 9 Gs with suits. However, record holders like John Sapp survived peaks of 46.2 Gs briefly. All right, so let's just say that, so if you're going to have trained NASA pilots only on these spacecraft, let's say that we can steadily take 10G. That just makes it easy for the math. Because so now instead of 9.2 meters per second squared, you could accelerate at a speed of 92 meters per second squared. So let's see. if we want to reach, let's see, 300 divided by 92. So it would take 3,260 seconds, which is not that long, to if you were at 10 Gs, to accelerate to near the speed of light. Which, if we look at that in minutes, I mean, a little less than an hour, 54.34 minutes at 10 Gs to accelerate to near the speed of light. So that is absolutely doable for a trained pilot to do. So you'd have to take 10 Gs for an hour, or what you could do in theory would be to do 10 Gs for like 10 minutes, and then a couple hours later do 10 Gs for 10 more minutes, then a couple hours later go to until you build up you do this 5 times basically, and you're at near light speeds. So that would definitely be a way to do it. But we don't have any way right now to create or project gravity. We haven't figured out a way to do that yet. Once we figure that out, then we can make atomic powered vehicles that could travel the stars. Hypersonic speeds are capable now. Who knows? Perhaps one day man might be able to travel this fast. I think we absolutely will. And if there is a way to travel faster than light, we will eventually do it. I don't know that it's possible, but if it is possible, we will. Let's see. Okay, it's been a while. I thought they made a point keeping the cab dark. Well, it's dark, but you still see the guy's arm. We can get close with an astrophage drive. I don't know what an astrophage drive is, because light has no mass. Well, that's another point of contention in physics. Does light have mass? If it's light is currently considered, it's a particle that has wave properties to it, or it's a wave that has particle properties to it. Does light have mass? Some people say yes, some people say no. I don't know. But because I think part of when we talk about accelerating to the speed of light is they suggest, and this is another problem with the mathematics, that it would take an infinite amount of energy to accelerate that fast, which is clearly not true. There's no such thing as an actualized infinite. And since light goes the speed of light, it doesn't have infinite energy accelerating it. So I don't agree with the idea of infinite energy. But as far as does light have mass, I tend to think it has a very, very tiny amount of mass. Mainly because, remember, if light, well, it's kind of dependent on how you view gravity. But if light had zero mass, and this is just one of those things that's kind of weird. Would light be affected by gravity? That's an interesting question. Some people argue yes, because with the bending of space-time, light simply travels a straight line path, but within a space-time curvature, it bends. However, if light has zero mass, would it? I don't know. Let's see. Astrophage is a substance they deal with in the upcoming Project Hail Mary. Oh, okay. So, yeah, when I see Hail Mary, then I'll know what astrophage is. Isn't pure oxygen actually dangerous? I don't know. I'm not a biologist. Let's see. And Robert doesn't read. I'm having duck for Christmas. Nice. We have duck. It's funny. We have a duck in the freezer, too. So I told my wife that she should make an actual turducken. No. Let's see. Roast beast. Yes, that's what you should have. That's every romantic. I'm saying that to Gorilla. That having duck that's every romantic. I'm not sure what you mean. 20 degrees speedo weather. It's not cold. It is minus 40 with a minus 70 cold is minus 40 with minus 70 wind chill. Well, then, like I said, if you believe that, do a video right now of you running around in a Speedo. I want to see it. I've got a jar of dirty. Guess what's inside? Well, if it's dirty, I'm going to guess dirt. Just wonder how accurate Interstellar was. Not at all. Let's see. I mean, the movie used time dilation mostly for the dilemma of outliving your family, etc. Well, yeah, the time dilation in Interstellar is complete and utter garbage. I'm sorry, it just is. Here's the problem with interstellar time dilation. So, could you experience severe time dilation by being close to a large gravitational field? Yes. Did that happen in the scene that they depicted? No. Because you had people on the surface of a planet. The planet, remember, the planet that was covered in a small layer of water with giant tidal waves. So there were people on the surface of the planet, and then you have people in the spaceship. And the people on the surface of the planet were there for a brief time while they fixed their ship and left. And the people on the spaceship were in orbit. And from their perspective, or actually, it was just one dude, I think, on the spaceship. And from his perspective, he was sitting there for like, I don't know, 20, 30 years, whatever it was. And the people, and so they came out and everybody's shocked, blah, blah, blah. So, and the problem here is twofold. So and they're, by the way, the planet that they're on is orbiting a black hole. So and I think that the reason they have this whole scenario is they suggest, well, black hole does weird things with time, blah blah blah, which is true, but only if you're really close to the black hole. And likewise on the planet, it's the way that gravity works. Its strength, its effect on you is directly dependent upon your distance to the center of mass of the gravitational force. So if you're talking about Earth, the closer you are to the center of the Earth, the more you feel gravity. So if you could dig a tunnel halfway down into the earth, which obviously by that time you wouldn't be able to survive because of the heat, but let's just say hypothetically you could, you would weigh a whole lot more. Likewise, if you go to the top of the highest mountain peak, you actually weigh less. So that's all. And the closer you are to this heavy gravitational field, the slower you go through time. So that's kind of where they get their time dilation. So on that level, okay, they're semi-accurate. Where they're not semi-accurate is that if you were in any kind of circumstance that was causing radical time dilation like we see in that, they would be so close to the source of such a strong gravitational force that they would all be crushed into spaghetti. Spaghettification is an actual scientific term that Stephen Hawking loved to use back in the day. But you would be absolutely suffering from severe spaghettification. So it would not work in that sense. Further, the black hole is in of itself a strong gravitational force. And if you were close to the black hole, you might get time dilation. But yeah, being on the surface of a planet is, especially if the gravity on that planet is low enough to where you could survive being on the surface of that planet, there's not going to be any time dilation. So that's that, at least not appreciable. No more than the time dilation of the astronauts on the International Space Station compared to those on planet Earth, which is such a tiny amount that, like, sure, someone who spends a couple of years up on the ISS may be a few nanoseconds younger than they would be if they stayed on Earth during that time, but it's not going to be such a huge number that you would notice it as far as the differences. Next week, Stephen, Seven Goes Me TV horror movie. It's classic Hammer classic Bride of Dracula. Okay, so Sven Gulli's Me TV horror movie is Hammer's Bride of Dracula. My wife loves Hammer films. I'm not so much a fan, but I've seen a few that I like. Past couple of days here in South Carolina, it's been in the low 60s. and it's 52 here now. Well, I don't know what the temperature is right now, but I think the high today is not supposed to get out of the 20s. Let me see. It's 22 right now, and the high today is 23. There's a Christian horror novel series called Shadowmancer. It's written by an Anglican bishop, if I recall. I've heard of it. I've never read it, so I don't know if it's any good. Yeah, that's the one, Maximum Overdrive. John Carpenter's The Reason Christine was a worthwhile Stephen King movie adaptation. Well, John Carpenter is a great horror movie maker. And so, yes, he is the reason Christine works so well. I also think, like Stephen King gets a little full of himself when it comes to movie adaptations of his work. Because, like, he hated the Jack Nicholson Shining movie, which was a classic. That movie is awesome. Now, did it follow the book beat for beat? No, it did not. And sometimes, when you're adapting a work, that's why it's called an adaptation. You don't follow the source material exactly. If you do, especially if you're adapting a thick novel, which Stephen King has a tendency to write, it's going to be a very boring movie, which is what we got with The Shining that came out later, the one called Stephen King's The Shining, which Stephen King heavily approved of, most people think is boring. In Duel, didn't the truck scream as it hit the bottom after it ran off the cliff? I don't remember. Just like the Shining TV short series is 100% faithful adaptation of the novel, look how terrible it was compared to the Shining movie. Yes, 100%. I just kind of said that. Who even remembers the Shining TV show? Not very many people. The only thing I remember about it is the dude from Wings was in it. And I didn't even get past the first episode because I thought it was so boring. Right, you can travel the galaxy, but you just can't go home to tell anyone about it. Well, you can go home. It's just that everybody you ever know will be long dead. And in fact, if you traveled all around the galaxy at near light speed, you'd be able to do it in weeks, maybe. But then you get home, and it's thousands upon thousands of years later, and maybe man has made ships way more advanced than the one you took out, and so now you can travel without time dilation or whatever. Or maybe man is extinct because we had a nuclear war because they had some crazy president that liked threatening people. Who knows? Your brain runs on electricity too. That is true. Well, your whole body does technically, but that's not. But the point of us mastering electricity is that we can use it synthetically all around us. And if we can figure out a way to do that with gravity, then our technology will exponentially improve. The problem is, I don't, the more we become dependent upon AI for crap, which AI just repackages and redistributes the same information in a different way, we'll never really advance. I will say Christian horror is the smallest niche I've ever heard of. Yeah, it's, don't get me wrong, you can do Christian horror, I'm sure, but it's hard to, I mean, I think that horror should have Christians in it, but I think to make a quote unquote Christian horror is difficult because the point, uh, you know, how do you, if you try to portray the people as true Christians, then they wouldn't be afraid, right? Assuming they're genuine, true Christians, right? They would latch on to Bible verses that tell them to only to not fear that which can kill you, to only fear that which can destroy your soul, and that's only God, right? So that you have nothing to fear from Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers or any of these guys, because if they kill you, you just go to see God. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And I know that sometimes atheists will use that as an argument for, well, why don't you just kill yourself? Or why shouldn't Christians want to die and stuff? And that's a fundamental misunderstanding, is that life is a gift from God. And, that would be an abuse of that gift. I don't want to die, but when I do, I'm not going to fear death. I might fear the process of death, like I don't want to suffer, but then nobody does, right? Jesus didn't want to suffer on the cross. He begged God to not have to have it happen, but it had to happen. All right, and I am actually caught up amazingly in 2 hours' time. That is just absolutely amazing. I'm kind of disappointed that our atheist buddies did not show up this week, but maybe they'll see this and I'll look for them next week because I do want to talk to them more. I do think that the Hawking Hartle proposition is fundamentally flawed, like I said at the beginning of this, and I think it's worthy of a real discussion. But in the meantime, guys, please remember, do not. And this is actually something that I think I should say more often. Don't take my word for it when I talk about biblical truths. Instead, look it up yourself. Read the Bible. Notice that when Gorilla asked that question about the marriage thing, we just go to the Bible and see what it actually says. And if you don't trust me, go to your Bible, see what it actually says, because it might say something different than you think, and it's worth looking into. Don't take anyone's word for it. Read it for yourself. Something that the ancient Catholic Church didn't want you to do.